Usually when we sit down to do a deep dive, we're looking outward. We're looking at global economics or the history of AI or, the mechanics of supply chains. We're usually analyzing these massive systems that operate out there in the world.
Right. Big abstract concepts, things you can study from a safe distance.
Exactly. But today, the stack of research you've brought to the table, it feels different. It feels a little uncomfortable, actually, because we aren't looking at a system out there. We're looking at something much closer to home, literally at the home. We are looking at the living room, the dinner table, and that very specific, very quiet tension that happens in a Christian household when faith stops being a Sunday thing and starts asking for your kids.
It is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And honestly, that is exactly where the source material starts.
Yeah.
We're diving into a collection of articles, some theological essays, all centered on engaging families in mission culture. And the core argument here isn't about theology in like an academic sense or church budgets or agency strategies. It's about a disconnect, a really quiet, really pervasive disconnect that the authors argue is shaping the next generation more than we realize.
There was a phrase in the reading that just jumped out at me immediately. I think it was in the opening chapter of the main source, the silent gap. Can we start there?
Yes.
Because it sounds like a thriller movie title, but I have a feeling it's much more personal.
It's deeply personal. So the silent gap is the term the authors use for this specific phenomenon in modern Christian families. The premise is this. If you survey most believing families, they're totally fine with loving God.
Sure.
They're fine with supporting the church financially. They might even love reading biographies of great missionaries, Hudson Taylor, Amy Carmichael, to their kids.
Right. We love the heroes. We love the stories of adventure and sacrifice, as long as it's someone else doing the sacrificing.
Exactly. We celebrate the mission story from afar. But the silent gap is that space between believing in God's global mission, theoretically, and the daily practice of preparing our own children for what the sources call costly obedience. It's a massive chasm between praying, Lord, send workers into the harvest, and Lord, send my kid into the harvest.
Oof. Yeah, that hits different. It's like, Lord, send workers, absolutely. But my kid needs to finish grad school, get a mortgage, and live within a 30-minute drive so he can see the grandkid.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that is the tension we're unpacking today. The sources argue that while we might sing about faith on Sunday, fear often speaks much louder when that call stirs in our own home.
So that's the mission of this deep dive then.
That's it. To explore how families can bridge that gap. How do we move from viewing missions as a job for, special forces, the professionals in the khaki vests, to something that belongs in the kitchen? Right. The thesis here is moving the family from being spectators to participants. It's about transforming the home from a fortress of safety, which is our default, into a launch pad for the kingdom.
I love that image. Fortress versus launch pad. It's so clear. But before we get into the how-to, because the sources do have some really practical stuff, we need to look at the why. The text calls it the biblical architecture of the household. Is this a new idea?
Not at all. In fact, the sources argue it's the original design. If you look at the Missio Dei, that's the Latin theological term for the mission of God, it didn't start with an agency.
Right.
It didn't start with a nonprofit or a board of directors. It started with a family.
You're talking about Abraham.
Genesis 12. This is crucial context. God's promise to Abraham wasn't just, I'm going to bless you, Abraham, so you can have a nice life. The promise was that all families of the earth would be blessed through him.
Through him.
The family unit was always intended to be the mechanism, the vehicle for God's global plan.
So it's not that the family exists just to be happy and secure. The family exists to be a conduit.
Exactly. And then you fast forward to Deuteronomy 6. This is a text that comes up constantly in the literature we reviewed. It places spiritual formation not in the temple, not at a classroom, but in the rhythms of daily life. When you sit, when you walk, when you rise. The home is the primary theological classroom.
Okay, so if that's the blueprint, if the home is supposed to be this incubator for mission, why is it so hard? The sources talk about a shift in the parents' role, from gatekeepers of safety to cultivators of vision. But I have to play devil's advocate here. Isn't it a parent's job to keep their kids safe? That feels like parenting 101.
That is the million-dollar question. And this is where the material gets really provocative. The authors identify what they call the safety trap.
The safety trap. Okay, that sounds ominous.
It's a cultural critique. Look, we live in a modern culture that obsesses over security, predictability, managed futures. We want to curate the perfect outcome for our kids. But the source argues that when families avoid intentional mission, when they prioritize comfort and safety above all else, they are unintentionally catechizing their children.
Catechizing is a strong word that usually implies like formal religious instruction.
It does, and that's the point. We're teaching them a doctrine, whether we realize it or not. We're teaching them that the highest good in life is to be secure, not to be faithful.
Wow.
If I tell my kids God is the most important thing, but every decision I make is based on risk avoidance and convenience and maintaining a certain standard of living, which lesson are they actually going to learn?
They're going to believe your actions. They're going to look at the budget and the calendar, not listen to the words.
Right. The source calls this incarnational formation. Faith is caught, not just taught. Children need to see parents making decisions based on obedience rather than convenience. That is how the architecture of the household shifts.
You stop building a wall to keep the world out, and you start building a ramp.
To send people out.
That's a heavy realization. It basically says our obsession with safety might actually be a spiritual stumbling block for our kids.
It redefines safety completely. It suggests the safest place for a child isn't necessarily in a gated community, but in the center of God's will, even if that will is dangerous, even if it's geographically unstable.
Okay, so that's the theology. We shift from fortress to launchpad. But let's get practical. How do we actually do that on a Tuesday night when everyone's tired, there's homework, soccer practice?
I know.
The sources mention practical rhythms. One phrase that stood out was, the table is seminary.
The table as seminary. It's a beautiful concept, isn't it? It implies that the most profound learning happens over dinner, not just in a lecture hall.
Right.
The sources break this down into a few key habits that reshape the family culture. The first one is prayer, but not the way we usually do it.
You mean not just, God is great, God is good, thank you for this food.
Right. The source suggests using emotional geography.
Emotional geography. Unpack that for me.
So usually our prayers are very localized. Help me with my test, bless grandma, that's fine. But the suggestion here is to use maps. Literally bring a map or a globe to the dinner table.
Okay.
Pick a nation. Pray for that nation specifically. And even better, pray for missionaries by name.
So it stops being abstract. It anchors the prayer in the real world.
Exactly. When a family prays for a specific country or a specific person serving in a hard place, the child's world expands. They start to see the world's brokenness and its beauty through God's eyes.
You're training their empathy to go beyond their own zip code.
You are. And the sources also talk about changing the conversation itself, mentoring across the table.
Yes. This is about the questions we ask. Instead of the default, how was school, which is basically a performance question, we should be asking vocational inquiry questions.
Give me an example of a vocational inquiry question for, say, a 10-year-old.
Something like, where do you feel God nudging you lately? Or what did you see today that broke your heart? Or who did you see today that looked lonely?
Wow, those are very different questions.
They signal that you expect God to be moving in their lives. You're validating their spiritual intuition.
And treating them as active participants in the kingdom, not just students. And then there's hospitality. The Force is very emphatic about this.
Yeah.
Invite missionaries into your home.
Real, live missionaries.
Yeah.
Eating your spaghetti.
Yes. Messy house, spaghetti, the whole thing. Because then mission becomes relational. It's not just a face on a prayer card on the fridge.
No.
It's Mr. and Mrs. Smith who told us about that difficult border crossing while we were eating dessert. Children need to see that missionaries are normal people. People who laugh and spill sauce on their shirts, who just said yes to God.
That brings it down to earth. But there's one more practical habit mentioned that I think might be the hardest for people.
The money talk.
The money talk. Generosity. Yeah, this one touches a nerve. We usually keep finances very private in our culture.
We do. It's almost taboo to talk about money with kids, other than maybe an allowance.
Right.
But the argument here is about stewardship. If we want children to understand that resources belong to God, they need to see how we budget for the kingdom.
Like showing them the numbers.
Yes, saying, hey guys, we have X amount of money. We could use this for a nicer vacation or a new TV, or we could support this family in Southeast Asia for 3 months. What do you think we should do?
That's powerful. It gives them skin in the game.
It shows that the family has priorities. If they see you cutting back on personal comfort to advance the kingdom, that teaches values way more effectively than a sermon on tithing ever could. It proves you believe it.
It brings it all back to that idea of participation versus spectatorship. But here is where the rubber meets the road. We can pray with maps, we can have missionaries over, we can give money. But what happens when it works? What happens when our kid actually says, okay, I'm moving to that place on the map?
This is part 3 of the source material, the theology of release. And the authors acknowledge this is the hardest step. It's the shift from courage to surrender.
The theology of release. Even the name sounds difficult.
It requires a fundamental shift in how we view our children. The expert voice in the text and scripture itself pushes us to move from possession to stewardship.
Meaning they aren't ours.
Right. We tend to view children as our property to protect, or maybe our projects to perfect. But biblical stewardship views them as gifts to be nurtured and eventually released back to the giver.
And the example is Hannah and Samuel.
Yes, from the Old Testament.
Oh, that story always gets me. She prays for a child for years, weeping. She finally gets him, and then she literally gives him back.
She nurtured him, she loved him, and she released him. And the text makes a crucial distinction. This wasn't abandonment. It was an act of worship.
I think for a lot of modern parents, that just feels terrifying. We want to control the outcome. We want to know they'll be safe.
And that's why the source suggests reclaiming rituals to help with this. It talks about the sacred sending. Think about the church in Antioch in Acts 13. When they sent Paul and Barnabas, it wasn't just a good luck, text us when you land.
Right. It wasn't casual.
It was fasting, prayer, laying on of hands, a commissioning. The force suggests families should have these commissioning moments.
Before a mission trip or even just leaving for college.
Exactly. Lay hands on them. Pray over them. Make it a ritual. It signals to the child that their obedience is honored. It tells them, we are not just letting you go, we are sending you. We are with you.
It frames their departure as a mission, not just a leaving.
It anchors them. But the source doesn't sugarcoat the emotions, does it? It talks about holding lament and joy together.
This is one of the most nuanced parts of the text, and I'm so glad you brought it up. There's this pressure to just be happy, to have the victory mindset.
Praise God, even when your heart is breaking.
Yes, because your kid is moving to the other side of the world. But the source says, no, the goal isn't stoicism. Tears and joy can coexist.
Like the Ephesian elders weeping with Paul in Acts 20.
Exactly. They wept because they wouldn't see him again. That's the lament. But they supported his mission. That's the joy.
The source says tears testify to love, but joy testifies to trust in God's sovereignty. If you don't have tears, maybe you don't love deeply enough. If you don't have joy, maybe you don't trust deeply enough.
You need both.
You need both to have a healthy sending.
That's incredibly freeing. It validates the grief parents feel without letting that grief become a barrier to obedience.
Precisely. That is the definition of the theology of release.
So we've covered the theology fortress versus launchpad. We've covered the daily habits. The table is seminary. We've covered the emotional release. But the source material takes it one step further into the long game.
No, it's not just about one generation.
Right.
Part 4 is legacy and intergenerational faith. And again, we have to redefine the word. Usually legacy means money, property.
Right.
Here, legacy is defined as the multiplication of faith.
And this is where the grandparents come in. I loved this part because usually parenting advice just stops at age 18.
It points to Lois and Eunice Timothy's grandmother and mother in the New Testament. The text says the faith dwelt first in the grandmother, then the mother, then Timothy.
An intergenerational transfer.
Exactly. The source suggests that grandparents have a specific, vital role in speaking identity and calling over their grandchildren.
What does that look like practically? Just telling them they're good kids?
It's deeper than that. It's spiritual observation, telling them, I see courage in you, or I see a heart for mercy in you that reminds me of Jesus. It's about spiritual elders affirming the potential for the kingdom in the next generation.
Creating what the text calls an unfolding redemption. The idea that one family's obedience creates a ripple effect.
Yes. Your obedience today sets a trajectory for your grandchildren's obedience tomorrow. It's playing the long game.
Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. From the silent gap of fear to the brave obedience of sending. For the listener right now who might be feeling a mix of conviction and maybe a little anxiety, how do they start? The source gives a very specific suggestion.
Yes, I highly recommend this. It calls for a family mission discussion night.
Okay, lay it out. How does it work?
It's a dedicated evening. You make a special dinner, you put away the phones, that's non-negotiable, and you discuss one single question.
Which is?
How can our family actively participate in God's global mission, not just as spectators, but as faithful partners?
That's a bold question to put on the dinner table between the lasagna and the salad.
It is, but it moves the conversation from what do I want to be when I grow up to What is God doing in the world and where do we fit? It changes the whole family narrative.
It feels like we are circling back to that initial choice. Fear versus faith. Fortress versus launchpad.
It really is a journey from fear to brave obedience. It's about realizing that if we truly believe what we say we believe, then the goal of parenting isn't just to raise productive citizens who are safe and comfortable.
No.
It's to raise arrows that are ready to be shot into the darkness.
And that requires the parents to be willing to let go of the bowstring?
That's the hardest part, but also the most rewarding, because that is what the bow is for.
So for everyone listening, the challenge from the source is simple. Identify one small, faithful act.
Just one. It doesn't have to be selling your house and moving overseas tomorrow. It could be a specific prayer for a nation you've never prayed for. It could be that conversation with your teenager. It could be a financial gift that stretches you a little bit.
It doesn't have to be massive, it just has to be obedient.
That's it.
I want to leave everyone with the final provocative thought from our source material. It's a question that kind of haunts you, in a good way. It's been sticking with me since I read it.
The question is this. If God is still calling and sending today, will your family be prepared to release what you love most into his hands?
That is the question. Not just, do you believe in missions, but will you release what you love most?
That's where the rubber meets the road.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you some tools to start building that launch pad.
And remember, your home is missional architecture. Use it well.
Thanks for listening. Go make your home a launch pad for the kingdom.